So thank you so much for joining. I'm Holly Hanley. Thank you. This is sponsored by the School of Education and the ABA program at University of West Florida, alongside the virtual chapter, the Gulf Coast Community of Practice chapter of ISPI. So just very, very honored and excited to have Dr. Carl Binder here with us today. And he's the founder and CEO of the Performance Thinking Network. And I'm really excited to have him tell a little bit of his story and everything. Just personally for me, it was a profound effect on me professionally. When I read Six Boxes, it made so much that I had learned prior to really click. And so it's amazing and such an honor to have Dr. Binder with us. So I'm just going to turn it over to him. So again, thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you so much. I didn't prepare a lot. What I thought I might do, first of all, there's a link. If you want to know all the gory details about my career, there's a link in the chat box that will take you to a article that is actually a chapter in a book by the Cambridge Center for Behavioral Studies. And so you might find it interesting reading, or maybe not, but I thought I would be sure it was available. What I thought I would do, I didn't really come with a kind of a formal presentation, but what I thought might be helpful would be to sort of, since my understanding is a bunch of people at various stages in their career, and I'm an old guy at this point, I can't believe it sometimes, but I'm 74 and I've been doing this stuff for about 50 years, which is hard to believe, but it's true. And so I especially what I heard beforehand when we were talking about doing this meeting is that a lot of you are sort of early in your career paths or maybe mid-career path, and sort of how do you get into this stuff? And one of the things, this stuff being performance improvement, and one of the things I always like to do when I meet new professionals in this field is to ask them how they got here, because there aren't many straight ahead paths. I mean, there's some people now that there are more and more degree programs in performance improvement and so forth. But even then, even how did you wind up in that degree program is always an interesting question, because people wind up from wildly different backgrounds. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about my, maybe not so wildly different, but my background, just to give you a sense of it, and then see what we all have to say. We can go way back. I was a Jesuit trained high school and college guy, and the Jesuits, for anybody who knows about them, they teach critical thinking, and they also teach service to the greater good, and I definitely learned that from them. And I was also in that era when, John Kennedy was saying, ask not what your country will do for you and all that. So I came up with a pretty strong interest in sort of figuring stuff out and figuring out how to help. And I started out in college at Seattle University as a math major, and I discovered very quickly that real math majors were lots better at math than I was. So I kind of moved out of that. And then I got drawn into philosophy. And what I found interesting about philosophy was that it kind of seemed to answer a lot of questions, or at least attempt to, about who we are and how we should be and stuff like that, the big issues. And I took a lot of courses at Seattle University, and I was ready to graduate at the end of 3 years in the summer. But the spring before I was going to graduate, two things happened. One was I was assigned to read Walden 2, which was B.F. Skinner's novel about what would happen if you built a community around principles of behavior science and was sort of self-managed community. And it kind of fit the 60s, and this was the 60s, because it was kind of like the scientific version of hippie communities or something, But I was appalled by it. I was like, oh, this is like mind control and all this kind of stuff. So that was one thing that happened. But the other thing that happened was I had been accepted to a doctoral program in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, which was a very broad program, and they had a lot of, they had some very interesting professors. So, but anyway, I got this book, Walden 2. And I read it and I was appalled. All the reasons that people push back on behaviorism who don't really quite know what they're talking about, but I didn't either. I was very fortunate. And if there's anything about my story, it's that I was fortunate. A lot of really lucky connections happened still have, but certainly in the early days. So I had a history professor whose wife was getting a PhD in behavior therapy at the University of Washington, and she said something to me, and I don't even know what it was, but she said, you should reread that book. So I reread the book, and I had this kind of blown off my horse, or whatever you want to call it, experience where I realized all this man is saying is if we apply a natural science approach to our own behavior, we can figure out how to improve education, therapy, management, social work, you name it, anything that had to do with human behavior. And I got really excited. And I wrote Dr. Skinner. I wish I had the letter, but this was before personal computers. So I scrawled it out, and then I typed it out in my typewriter and sent it to him. I wrote him a fan letter. And he actually sent me back a letter. I think I might even have this to share. Let's see if I do. He sent me back this letter that was sort of mind-blowing in that, first of all, I got a letter from him in 2 weeks, and that right in its own right was kind of stunning. But the other part of it, maybe I don't, I thought I had it here someplace. The other thing about it was he said, oh yeah, here we go. Let me see if I can share this on the screen. Just so you can believe it's real. So this is a letter I got from Dr. Skinner. And the beginning of it, I apparently said something that I misunderstood his position in the book, but I liked his last paragraph. He said, I myself had only one student last year, and I'll probably have none this year. He was toward the end of his teaching career, but I no longer have a laboratory, so I'm not in a good position to supervise experimental work. But I'm impressed by your commitment, and I will do what I can to give you help. Possibly a spot in this vicinity could be found where you could do graduate work without too much of a waste of time. Now, what I learned later from Dr. Skinner was he had no tolerance for academic politics, zero, and that was a disadvantage if you were a student in some ways, because he didn't play politics for his students. He would help you if you asked, but that was it pretty much. And so I thought, oh, that's really exciting. But I went ahead. And he said, you should probably go ahead to the philosophy program. So I went ahead to the doctoral program, but I also signed up for the master's, the graduate school program in experimental psychology at Notre Dame, which was old style experimental psychology. It wasn't really Skinner's kind of work, but I still thought, well, maybe I'll get a PhD in philosophy and a master's degree in psychology, and that'll be cool, But by the end of the first semester, I realized I did not want to be a philosopher. I did not want to pick some esoteric little thing and make stuff up for the rest of my life in some academic sense. So I switched into the psych department, and I was in that program, but I didn't really like it much. So that summer, in July, I had a friend at Notre Dame who lived in Boston, and he was driving back to Boston. So I said, hey, can I get a ride with you? I just kind of hitched a ride with my friend. Went to Boston, went to Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Harvard is, found Dr. Skinner's office. And I had I was like a hippie graduate student. I had long hair and a beard and kind of didn't look like who knows what. But anyway, knocked on his door. He was there. He sat me down. He talked to me for an hour. And at the end of the hour, he said, have you ever thought about applying here? And I said, well, not really. Harvard, I kind of figured that was above my whatever. He said, well, let me introduce you around. So he introduced me around to the professors that were kind of important in the department. And he said, you should consider applying here. So this was July. So I applied, and they let me in. Now, they didn't let me in with any money. And in the meantime, I'd gotten a full ride thing at the University of Iowa. They were going to give me a fellowship and all this stuff, and I'd have plenty of money and all that. And of course, my parents, I was a pretty poor kid. My parents, said, well, go to Iowa. That's obvious, isn't it? I said, you're kidding, I'll do whatever it takes to go to Harvard. So I packed up my stuff, put it in a Greyhound bus, went to the bus station in Boston, put my stuff in a locker, which wasn't a lot of stuff. Took the subway into Cambridge, Harvard Square. I'm sitting there. I used to roll my own cigarettes. I mean, I looked like I didn't look like a graduate student, I don't think. And I was sitting there in Harvard Square, and I had no idea where I was going to stay. I had no idea where I was going to get money or anything else. And so this guy, kind of working class guy, walks by, and he says, oh, hi, stranger, you look like you're traveling, and struck up a nice conversation with me. And he said, where are you going? I said, well, I don't know. This girl on the bus said maybe I could stay with her, or maybe I'm going to try to call her. And of course, we didn't have cell phones then. So he said, well, good luck, So I went into the tavern to have a beer or something. So I got on the phone, no answer to the young lady that I'd met on the bus. Okay, so I'm out there sitting. So this guy comes back and he says, well, how'd it go? And I said, well, she wasn't there. He says, want to come home with me? I thought, yeah, okay, maybe, you know. So he takes me home. It's a very nice house, introduces me to his wife and two daughters, uh, put me up, give me a nice meal and all that stuff. Stayed overnight, went into Harvard Square, got a job washing cars at a local car company, got a room for $11 a week near Harvard, New Harvard. In those days, that was cheap, really cheap then too, but it was, you know, affordable. And I think I had a small loan to cover some expenses, kind of student loan, like $1,200 or something. And of course, school wasn't as expensive then. So then, so I had a room, had a lot of cockroaches, but that was okay. It was walking distance from the building. So at Harvard, they had this thing first semester, first week, where you can try out classes, you can audit classes. And so I went and tried one out called Philosophical Problems in Psychology. And it was taught by this old philosophy guy who was pretty cool, Nelson Goodman. At the end of the first class, he says, "Oh man, there's more students here than I thought. I'm going to need a teaching assistant." So I run screaming up to the front of the room. They, you know, pick me. I'm a philosophy major, blah, blah, blah. So, okay. So all of a sudden, I got my tuition covered because I was a teaching fellow. So the first message, and then I wound up at Harvard, and then they eventually gave me a fellowship and stuff. But the message to me, for especially young people, is if you see something you really care about, go for it. You know, if you know, jump off the cliff if it's that important to you, and it was to me. So that was the first bit that was kind of important. So I studied with him for a couple of years, did independent studies with him, read one of his kind of important books, Verbal Behavior, with him, and helped him kind of edit, along with a lot of other people, the manuscript for one of his later books about behaviors, and learned a lot about how he thought about things and how careful he was with his language and so forth. Didn't really find anything else in the Department of Psychology that was interesting, that I cared about, which was fine. Although I did audit a bunch of classes by this famous guy, Irvin DeVore, who was a primate anthropologist who studied you know, anthropology by studying apes of various kinds, and went to Africa in the summers and had amusing lectures with his pictures of, you know, orangutans and such, or whatever, you know, all kinds of primates. But other than that, I didn't really learn much of Harvard that was very interesting. But when I finished my coursework, I wanted to do something with humans. So Skinner introduced me to a fellow who was a local professor, and at the time he was at Boston College, and he was the president of the Association for Behavior Analysis, or no, for behavior therapy at the time. And he was very nice. He was like a godfather, a very nice Italian guy. Joe Cautello was his name, and he spent an hour with me in his office and advising me. And he sent me to a woman named Beatrice Barrett, who I'd never heard of, who turned out to be a brilliant laboratory behavior scientist, but she came from a clinical background. And she was very interested in assessment. And she'd come to work as a postdoc with Skinner and one of Skinner's most important students, Ogden Lindsley. And because Skinner's science was entirely based on what the measure that he discovered, rate of response, count of responding over time, that he looked at on what he called a cumulative recorder. And what he said when he was asked much later what his most important contributions were, he said it's the measurement technology. All the discoveries were just kind of the discoveries, but the science he created was with this rate of response measure, which is the most sensitive measure of behavior. So anyway, I wound up in this lab. I spent the first year doing basic research in the lab with humans, because she had a laboratory in the basement of the Fernald State School, which at that time was politically correctly and clinically correctly called the oldest institution in the Western Hemisphere for the mentally retarded. So we had institutionalized people who were, many of whom were put there in birth. They wouldn't learn stuff like we would, even if you and I have lousy instruction, we'll probably learn some things. These people wouldn't learn anything. So it was a great environment to try to understand how to develop effective instruction. So I got involved in what's now called precision teaching, which was bringing into the educational environment Skinner's measure, rate of response, so that instead of measuring just accuracy, which is what we've all been through from elementary school through graduate school, you measured how many correct and incorrect responses to some whatever per minute, per unit time. And if you think about it, for example, let me give you an example. If I gave you all a sheet that had 100, let's say 100 or 150 addition problems on, like 3 plus 7 and 2 plus 5 and like that, and I said, I'm going to give you a minute, write as many answers as you can in a minute. competent adults would be someplace between about 60 correct a minute and probably about 100 or so correct a minute. There's a range of competent performance. Now, little kids in schools never get a chance to practice enough to even to get past 20 or 30 problems a minute. And if you think about it, if it takes you 2 seconds to know what 2 plus 5 is or whatever, you're going to be in deep trouble when you get to story problems or things like that. So what happened was I was an early participant in what was called precision teaching, which was basing the measurement and practice of all kinds of stuff, but in this case, it was kind of academic skills, mostly pre-academic skills, with a time dimension. So I did that, and I worked in that lab and that classroom for about 10 years, and I supervised research in the classroom, and I consulted with teachers all over the state and eventually all over the country, and I got to really be an education guy and precision teaching guy, and I had trained master students and all that. But in about 1982, Ogden Lindsley, who was kind of the main thought leader for this precision teaching work, said to me, he said, I want you to take what we've learned and take it into business. And I didn't know anything about business. And so okay, Ogden. And so I eventually basically retired from the lab after about 10 years. I started my first company, which was called Precision Teaching and Management Systems. And I always used to talk about us. It was incorporated, but it was just me. But I presented a little bit bigger image, perhaps, and I put a good suit on and stuff. And for a while, I was cleaning houses to cover the rent because I, by that time, was married. But I found an opportunity, and the opportunity was I was talking about this fluency thing, because when you practice with a time dimension, you achieve a level of quickness and accuracy that we can call fluency, and people understand that word. And so I'd been talking every chance I got about that. And that's when I made contact with ISPI. I didn't know about the International Society of Performance Improvement up to that point, even though a lot of the original thought leaders in that field, in that organization, came from the program instruction world, which really came out of Skinner's work and some other people's work. But I didn't know about it. So somebody turned me on to it. And in Boston, there was a small chapter. It was kind of just piddling along a little bit. So as you all maybe know, most organizations like that, if you volunteer, they'll let you do it, whatever it is, And so I volunteered to be program director. And in the meantime, one of my main mentors in the education work, a man named Eric Houghton, had also worked in the Office of Program Instruction at Harvard, where Tom Gilbert spent a little bit of time as a postdoc. So he knew about Gilbert, and he'd given me Gilbert's book, Human Competence, in about 1980. And I kind of looked at it, I thought, this is kind of interesting, but until I moved out of the corporate world, I thought, this is good, I'll read it, and kind of did. But then what happened was I joined ISPI, became the program chair for the Massachusetts chapter, and then they let me be president, partly because nobody else would do it. And so in the first year or so, I was able to triple the membership just by kind of outreach. And I also was able to bring Tom Gilbert and Marilyn Gilbert up to Boston to do a workshop. And I'd never met them before, but now I did. And Tom was a wild and crazy character, to be sure. And Marilyn was, if it hadn't been for Marilyn Gilbert, who was a great writer and editor, that book never would have happened. But so I got to meet them, and I started a relationship with them. And then, but what happened was, I had this fellow at Omega Performance Corporation. And there's another lesson in here, which is that, at least for me, a lot of people talk about goals, but I've always got sort of a horizon. I want to make a difference. I want to do it with behavior science, because as soon as I met Skinner, I realized this is what I want to devote my life to. I want to somehow take the science and make it available to as many people as I can to help them. That was kind of my mission. So I was always kind of looking for that, but I didn't have specific plans at all. I was just looking for kind of opportunities, And so what happened was, I was talking about this fluency thing a lot, and I even published an article in Training Magazine, even though I'd really never done it with adults. It was called Bridging the Confidence Gap, because when you become fluent, you're confident. When you're just accurate but kind of not very quick, you don't feel very confident about stuff. So I talked about that, and this fellow, banks then were going through deregulation. And now bankers who used to have to wait till people came in to ask for loans could now be salesperson. So this company, Omega Performance Corporation, which at the time was the biggest, most prominent company in the training of bankers, sort of technical training, like risk analysis and stuff like that, they wanted to create a sales curriculum because now they had to turn bankers into salespeople. So they hired a guy to teach sales skills. And I started to learn about that. I didn't know anything about this. So I read Neil Rackham's book, which I recommend to everybody, Spin Selling. Dr. Neil Rackham was a professor in a university in the UK, and he studied dyadic relationships. He observed people in pairs communicating. And at some point, somebody asked him if he could consult with around sales performance, which is a dyadic thing. So he did. And out of that, after thousands of observations and drawing in, colleagues and so forth, he created this thing called spin selling. And spin is an acronym. It says in any effective sales engagement or conversation, you first of all ask questions about the situation of the person. And this is, by the way, something that I believe every single person who's a performance consultant should learn about. Because if there's one thing that I've learned is I've observed both my colleagues in the behavior science world, who may be organizational behavior management people, they may be applied behavior analysts, and in the performance improvement world, is that by and large, we're terrible at sales and marketing. We want to say, look at our cool thing and how cool it is. And actually, nobody cares too much about our cool thing until we can show how it addresses their needs or problems. And I've seen this not just among our colleagues, but also in technical companies. Because later I got working in sales in like high-tech software, hardware, digital equipment corporation, medical devices companies, where people were kind of science and techie, but they weren't really that good at addressing the needs of the customer. So anyway, I read that book and it had a big effect on me because it made me recognize that the way sales training is normally done is about ways to identify customer needs and then talk about solutions. But the way product knowledge is usually done is not like that. Usually it's just features and benefits. It's look at our cool stuff and how much better it is than the other guys, which might work. But what we did is we did an instructional design twist, which is we did what we called a customer needs model, where I would work with a group of people who were actually from whatever the company was. In this case, it was banks. And we would figure out what the needs or problems were that their products could address. And we could then teach them, need solutions pairings. And then if you have the solution, you can talk about how the solution works. So anyway, I was talking about fluency. So this guy says, can you apply this to product knowledge? I go, no, I've never done that before. So that's when I read Rackham's book and I started to understand this. And so what we did is we built a program for bankers that had practice activities in it. We built what we would call the components, the need solutions, the features of the product that you need to be able to talk about, responding to key objections in a comfortable, competent, fluent way. And so we built verbal repertoires basically by starting with small pieces and giving people a lot of practice. The thing is, in order to get enough practice, the salespeople had to do it on their own. They couldn't just do it, in the classroom, because you had to do it every day for a few weeks to practice these short timings and activities and monitor your own performance. So that's when Gilbert kicked in, because I looked at the behavior engineering model. I said, wait a minute, we're doing this thing down in what he called the knowledge segment of the behavior engineering model. And I'm betting that most people here know about that model. And but if we're going to get people to practice on their own, and then if we're going to get people to apply this on the job, we're going to have to look at the top row of that model. We're going to have to give them information about what, data, he would say, what we now call expectations and feedback. We'd have to set those expectations. We'd have to be sure that they had tools for practice and self-monitoring, and they knew how to use their sales collateral and all that. We'd have to reward them or recognize, yeah, that's good, you're getting better at this. So I used the behavior engineering model as a framework for designing an implementation planning process that leveraged all those things. It wasn't just spray and pray, train them and hope. And it worked. And in fact, it blew the top off of anything. People would come to us And we published some things from Bank of Boston and Shawmut Bank and a few other banks. And people said, we'd have people coming up to us and say, I've been selling this stuff for 5 years, and these kids know more about it than I do. And we had things like a lot of the traditional product training that people did that they thought of as kind of advanced used case studies. So they'd give trainees things to read about the products, to read about an industry, and then they'd take a small group of people and they'd give them a case study that they had to work through and figure out what the problems were and the needs, and then figure out what they would sell to them, and then get up and give a presentation. And that was a pretty classic throw them in the deep end of the pool with a little bit of background and see how it works. Well, the guys that were working with me on the sales skills side, they built these 3 very nicely designed case study exercises. And I still remember what this looked like. The first time we ran the program, these young bankers had been practicing with my stuff for, a couple weeks. So they come in, they get in, they do the first case study, and they just nail it. It was really good. They really were able to present how they were going to address the needs with the features of the training program, or the products rather, of the bank, and talk about how this would benefit the customer. And I was like, oh, that's pretty good. And then they did a second one. And at the end of the second one, they had one of their members get up and say, we realize you guys have a third case study for us, but we don't really need it. We got this. And so it kind of blew everybody's minds, except that the data showed ultimately that these people knew their stuff really well. So I published an article about this, and I showed measured changes in correct responses per minute on a timed multiple choice test, for example. Because when you time them, everybody will admit that multiple choice tests are a pretty lousy way to assess anything, because you can guess, right? But what if I give you 3 minutes to do 30 items? In that context, if you know your stuff and you're not guessing, you're just saying, yep, that's the answer to that, you move really quickly. So a timed multiple choice test can actually show sensitive differences between people who know stuff for sure and who don't. So we did that. We published those data, and the people who'd gone through our practice activities were 2 or 3 times quicker, and you could look just as a reality check. It would take them maybe 3 seconds to respond to an item. And if somebody asked me a question in a sales situation and I could respond in 3 seconds, that's just fine. But if it takes me 12 seconds, that's probably not going to work. And I'm probably going to have to sort of, work my way through that. So I published that, and I actually published it, I believe, we published it one place, but I think we put it in Performance Improvement, which was the P&I, monthly magazine journal type thing that ISPI had. And within a few weeks, I was getting calls from Digital Equipment Corporation and people in other industries saying, can you do this for us? And I said, yeah, I think so. So I started a company. I started a second company. And it was a joint venture company with Information Mapping Incorporated. Anybody here know about information mapping? I bet you might not. Well, I should tell you about it, because Bob Horn, who was the creator of information mapping, was also an ISPI guy who got the Gilbert Award. And Bob Horn came up through Columbia University's program in instruction kind of research, but he was interested in documentation and not training specifically. So he actually kind of invented structured writing, as it's called now. And he took principles from readability research, from how much you can scan on a page, from graphic layout, from Merrill's component display theory, from a whole bunch of things, from instructional design, from different fields, integrated them into this methodology that you could teach people systematically to produce documentation that was measurably easier and quicker to use. And he did his research with giant documentation sets from like government agencies and the phone company and such, proved that you could access and read and get information much quicker in information mapped documents, which involved how you analyze the content, how you organize it, and how you present it. So I had gotten to know Bob, and for a while, his company, which was about a $10 million a year company, and my little $500,000 company, he was my subcontractor. His company was my subcontractor. And finally, I said, why don't we form a separate company? So we formed a company called Product Knowledge Systems in 1992. So this was almost 10 years after this kind of entrance into the corporate thing. And I had a unique offering. Nobody else knew about this fluency-based instruction stuff. So we ran product knowledge systems for almost 10 years in Boston. And we had what we were generally called in, and I had a team of really sharp people. It was wonderful. There were about 20 employees, and we had 20 or 30 contractors. And I got to learn then a lot about different industries. And one of the things we did there, which I think could be useful to some people, depending on what your field and what you do, um, is we started out with this customer needs model idea and how to document that to make it helpful, how to practice materials, how to practice activities and verbal repertoire, basically. And then also we created information mapped reference materials. We would take all the PowerPoints, well, they didn't have PowerPoints, but the slides and the marketing materials and all that. We would digest that and produce a manual that was really easy to find stuff. Boom, you need to find information. Boom, here it is. That was even before stuff being online, using the information mapping method. And we were known. I mean, we were hired by companies like Microsoft and Genentech and Oracle when they were doing major product launches because they realized we could get their reps up to speed really fast. And so that was a company we went for about, I guess, almost 10 years. And eventually I was from the Seattle area. So eventually I moved back to the West Coast and married my person that I'd been having a long-term relationship with. And we dissolved product knowledge systems. And basically I distributed the major clients to the folks that work for me. And a couple of them went another 5 or 6 years just based on those clients. But I learned in that context a few things. One is I really learned the power of structured documentation. Secondly, I learned we developed a framework we called the product knowledge architecture, and it was started as a table of contents for a reference book, which had a unique characteristic. If you think about it, most reference documents are not very good for learning because the same thing, they don't go in a sequence. They aren't usually built in a prerequisite sequence, and they're usually alphabetized or something, a reference document. Most learning things are built in a sequence, and you might have the same topic repeated more than once in different contexts. So we managed to create this essentially table of contents with a lot of sub areas and templates in it that both you could read through it or use it as a basis for learning in a sequential way, but also there was only one place for any given topic, like the market trends or the customer needs or like that. And so we developed this thing over quite a few years period across industries: high tech, biotech, pharmaceuticals, insurance, trucking, communications, 2 or 3 other industries. And what we learned in that context was what was similar to sales knowledge, no matter what industry you were in. So the table of contents framework that I mentioned worked, but also what was different, because we knew if we went into after the 3rd or 4th medical devices company, you get to know sort of what the topics are for that industry. So we learned a lot about templating things. And from an instructional and document design point of view, that was enormous, because what it meant was I could go into a first meeting for 2 hours. If somebody calls and said, we'd maybe like you to do a product launch for us, I'd say, we'll get together a small group of people who are customer facing, your marketing people, some of your salespeople in a room, and give me a couple hours. In a couple hours, I could do on a flip chart a table of contents for their stuff, and 2 days later come back with it and scope a project, and it would blow their minds because they told me stuff and I knew how to put it in this template framework. And then we could very efficiently build, this stuff. And so we were a premium cost company, but the beauties of working in the sales world is that, especially if it's a product launch, there's money available, it's urgent, they don't have to mess around. If you can do it, they'll hire you, So it was a very fortunate thing to fall into. In the process, we also began to learn about accomplishment-based performance improvement, because that by that time I was going to ISPI every year in the national conference. I was presenting 2 or 3. I tried to present as many proposals as I could submit. I also, one of my goals was they used to do a thing at the ISPI conferences called the encore presentations. And what it was the top 10 presentations from the previous year in terms of, smile sheets would get to present again. And I managed to do that 6 or 7 times. And so that was always like my goal, to be one of the best ones, And so I got a lot of visibility, and that helped a lot. And I also did basically the same thing as writing Dr. Skinner. I got to meet Tom Gilbert, and I'd stick to him like glue. I got to meet Joe Harless and Don Toasty and Bob Mager, and the list goes on. And another recommendation I make to anybody at any level in a career path, whether it's thinking about graduate school or training, or when you really want to develop, is try to do that. Don't just go to a program, just don't go to a conference, but go stick to people. Find a way to connect up with them. And one of the things that I learned a lot, and I now tell every time, like this week even, but I was also at the University of North Texas a couple of weeks ago with some graduate students. A lot of young people, and maybe some of you are in that category, are a little hesitant to approach people who are viewed as thought leaders or big time people in their field. But I will tell you, I've never had a person refuse me. And as one of those old people now who's apparently some kind of a thought leader, what I've learned is that if somebody comes up to me and is interested in my work, there's nothing better from my point of view than to tell them. I mean, you can tell I'm blathering on right now. And one of the things I've learned is stick to those people like glue. Go after the people whose work you admire and like, and see if you can get to know them, and see if you can take them to dinner or go to their presentations or get their phone number or their email address or whatever it is, because chances are they'll be more than happy to help if they can. And I sort of checked that out with a lot of my colleagues and some of my more senior people, although most of my more senior people are dead by now, but and everybody pretty much agrees. And so I want to just be really clear with people. Don't be afraid to do that, connect with people. So anyway, I did that a lot at the ISPI conference. And what I managed to do in particular was I really began to understand accomplishment-based performance improvement. And those of you who've studied Gilbert and his book, which I think a bunch of you probably have, probably recognize that the book is brilliant and Tom was brilliant, but it's by no means linear. And it's a lot more ideas than most people can probably apply in a whole career. And I didn't glom onto all the ideas, but I definitely, the accomplishment-based thing really changed my perspective on the world, because I started out focusing on behavior. And then I realized, wait a minute, as Gilbert said, behavior is costly. It's the valuable products of behavior we care about, the milestones in a sales process or whatever it is. And so that taught me a lot. And then, but Tom was, he was never particularly financially successful. He more or less left his wife penniless or close to it. He was not a particularly successful business person. He was, had a reputation for a lot of crazy stuff, but he was brilliant. But Joe Harless was his protege, and Joe was a student with him at the University of Alabama, roll tide, as they say. And Joe wanted to play football, but he was too small. So Bear Bryant, who was then the coach who kept having national football championship teams, basically got Joe to tutor his football players' students so they could stay in school. But in the meantime, Joe glommed on to Tom Gilbert and became his protege. And then when he graduated, they worked together for a while. But like many people who tried to partner with Gilbert, it didn't. They broke up. It was hard to work with Tom. And but Joe went on to have a very successful consulting business. And then, as some of you might know, he developed some very detailed, very highly effectively job-aided programs for front-end analysis, for job aids, and for what he called accomplishment-based curriculum development. And so I actually learned probably more from Joe, a lot more than from Gilbert, because Joe really showed you how to do it at a very fine grade level. The only downside to Joe's approach, and we used to have conversations about this, because anybody who knows about my work recognizes that I haven't job aided it down to the last nit. I've created these models and a way of thinking through stuff that is pretty flexible, but it takes some craft and some experience to apply it. Whereas Joe used to say, I know that people don't like all the job aids, but the more I job aid it, the more consistent the results. So he could go into places like Boeing and US Coast Guard and a few other places, and who really needed to have a systematic shared approach, and they bought into it and they do it. And they, like Coast Guard, still uses Joe's stuff. So anyway, I learned from those guys, and I stuck to Harless like glue, and I would be on the phone with him anytime I could. And he was very, one of the things he told me, this is a real side thing, but he was a Southern guy, and you say, I'm a good old boy. He says, you got to have a shtick. If you're a consultant, he said, you got to have a shtick. He says, mine's good old boy. Yours ought to be boy scientist. And that's when I was kind of young, and I did kind of come across as boy scientist. But anyway, that turned into the work that I'm doing now. But a couple other things to mention before I be quiet and see what you guys have to say is when I moved to California, we did two things. A big part of it was by that time, this whole fluency-based instruction thing, we turned into a workshop, what was called the Fluency Building Workshop. And I would go into companies and teach them about instructional design using a fluency-based approach. And then I would coach them through projects. So for example, I did that at Amazon.com. Oh, and also I started getting requests from customer service organizations. And what's interesting, if you think about a call center, I don't know how many people know about call centers, but in a way, it's very much like sales. You have to develop a verbal repertoire. You have to be able to address problems and with solutions and know some stuff. But you also have to be able to operate usually more than one, sometimes a half a dozen systems on a screen. You have to know when to escalate to somebody that knows more than you do, or that can handle a problem that you can't. And very often you have to do this while somebody's yelling in your ear. So it's a very challenging environment, but we were able to take everything that we'd kind of learned about building fluent performance in sales, apply it in the in the customer service world, but in addition, give people ways to get fluent using their computers. And so anybody here, I don't know if we can do hand raising exactly, but anybody here ever worked in customer service call center environments? Okay, so I don't know how you approached using, Dawn, I don't know how, and anybody else, I don't know how you approached using computers, but most of the training that I watched before we ever showed up was with respect to using systems. They would have some instruction, but then there would be these kind of scavenger hunty things where they'd say, well, spend about 20 minutes and poke around or do the following exercises. And they weren't timed. They were just kind of explore the system. And in retrospect, what I learned was, because what we did, it's very different. What we did is we said, okay, here's 30 items on a particular part of using the system. Let's say the account database. So everybody's, every customer's account number is in there. So we'd have people pair up. We'd give them a sheet of questions like, what's John Doe's account number? What's, Betty Smith's address, and like that. And we would have one read it, and the other one would look for it, and they'd say, yep, you got it. And they'd do that as fast as they can. What they were trying to do is get as many of those done in, let's say, 3 minutes as they could. So they had practice, and we had people saying, I'm dreaming about this stuff, because we'd have them practice in little 2 and 3 and 4 minute intervals. And the classroom looked like a gym. It was noisy and it was rambunctious. But at the end of the day, instead of coming out like your usual bleary-eyed 8-hour-a-day trainees, these people were all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed because they were getting better and they could see themselves getting quicker. And what we had by the end of a couple of weeks, typically, or a week and a half training, would be people who could use the system without even thinking, all the different systems. And for example, there's an article we published from AT&T Wireless that we did. And it used to take the AT&T Wireless people about 2 months to get their beginning customer service reps up to the number of solutions or calls per hour that was their benchmark. And we got it to 2 weeks. And you can imagine that the business people thought that was pretty cool. If you can get our people up to speed in 2 weeks instead of 2 months, that's worth serious money. So we demonstrated that. We showed the data, and again, got more and more requests. Amazon was a funny case in that regard, because I did the same thing with Amazon. This was early on in the early 2000s. And I was working in call centers in North Dakota where they had low cost of living, universities, smart young people who could work in call centers. And so I traveled in North Dakota a lot for a while. And about 6 months after we did that project, I asked my client at Amazon, I said, well, can you tell me what the results were? And I remember she looked at me and said, well, no, we're Amazon. We don't tell anybody anything. But she said, I can tell you this. We promised our management that if we brought you in, we could improve productivity by at least 25%. We just blew the top off of that. So I knew that I made a difference there too. So we learned how to do this fluency-based thing. We kind of invented it, really. We learned about sales performance and customer service performance. We were able to do that repeatedly because, again, you develop templates. You learn how to do it for the next one with slight modifications. We got a reputation. I talked a lot at ISPI about this stuff. And we still weren't fully accomplishment based. We were still kind of working in the knowledge domain, but we were definitely using the behavior engineering model to think through how to implement. But as I've said in countless presentations, including the recordings that we did this last week, the challenge with the behavior engineering model was me and my team members, we were nerdy, we loved it. But when we showed it to our clients to try to engage them, the language in Tom's model just didn't work for them. And they couldn't figure out what data we were talking about or what instruments meant or whatever. And if those of you who've been around ISPI for a while may realize that other people, there was a bunch of my sort of contemporaries who tweaked some of the language. In fact, some of them even borrowed some of the language that we created. But we took a very user testing approach. We said, we're going to keep changing these words in the cells of the model until we can introduce it to people. And they may not be masterful, but they won't make category errors. They won't say stuff like, well, data, what do you mean by data? No, we don't mean data. We mean everything that sets expectations and gives you feedback. Or instruments, like, what is that? Well, tools and resources. It's all the things that you need and use while you're performing, whether it's literally software, hardware, screwdrivers, et cetera, or whether it's time, ventilation, work design, and so forth. So we tweaked the language, and this was toward the end of the 80s, mid or end of 80s. And finally, we got this language. And I remember the first time I really got this, I was working in Southern California at a newspaper as a consultant. And I was on my way out on a given day, and this guy says, hey, Dr. Binder, can you come over here? And I think they didn't call me Dr. Binder. I think they called me Carl, which is what I prefer usually. But anyway, can you help me with something? Oh, okay. So I went over, and I don't even remember what it was he was doing, but I said, oh, this might help. So I drew out the 6 boxes, and I labeled them using our language. And I said, this might help. And I don't even remember what I said. But I came back 2 weeks later, and he said, hey, Carl, come over here. I've been using this. And I think what he said is, look, we realized that we could give people a job aid and save money and not have to train them so much or something. But they were starting to get it. So we then sort of systematically checked out with a lot of people and was like, yep, this language works. Now I still stumbled over what to call it because I wanted to pay homage to Tom because that's where it came from. But at one point, a few years later, I was in the early 90s, I was at Dun & Bradstreet working with a sales organization, and I was in the back of the room. And or I wasn't in the back of the room, I was in the front of the room, but the VP of sales training was in the back of the room, Tom Hogan. And I was stumbling over this thing, and he just says, you're always talking about those boxes. Why don't you just call it the 6 boxes? So I said, okay. And so we started calling it that, and eventually we trademarked it because there were so many. If you were to do a literature search in the ISPI literature on either the behavior engineering model or the 6 boxes, you would see it's all over the place. There's all these versions that have different words in them. People have called Gilbert's model the 6 boxes. There's even one publication that had a 2x3 arrangement of it, so it was 3 high and 2, which misses the whole point. And so we trademarked it so that people know this is the 6 boxes model. So that has grown like wildfire. And as I think it's said in the little write-up, I don't make that big of a deal of it. But a couple of years ago at the National ISPI conference, somebody ran a session that I didn't know they were going to run where they were talking about it and they voted for the best performance model in the world, and the 6 boxes won. And I think it's mostly because I've been talking about it since the 80s and because it's easy to use. Even if you don't use it very well, it's better than most of the other things you might use. So that's part of a stream of discovery for me, which is always looking for better ways to do stuff based on things like simplicity and user experience so that we can make training and learning more efficient. And it was also about packaging, because if you're a consultant or whether even an internal person inside of a company, you'd like to be productive. And so if you can create useful templates and models that you can tweak for the next project instead of starting with a blank piece of paper, as long as they're really help you do analysis rather than stuffing something into a model that isn't quite right, it saves you time and money. And so then the only other things I want to say are that ISPI to me was my original organization in the 70s, and really up until about 10 years ago, was the Association for Behavior Analysis. And that was the home place of B.F. Skinner and his proteges. Now, that has now turned into a trade organization, as far as I'm concerned. It's mostly about people in the applied behavior analysis world, most of whom have companies or work in organizations to serve people with autism or disabilities. That's great, but it's no longer, for me at least, the scientific reservoir of all these brilliant scientists as it used to be. It's mostly business people and practitioners who work for them. But ISPI became my second family in the early mid 80s. I remember the first year I went to the national conference, Margot Murray, whose name you might know, she's still around. She's known for mentoring work. She was the president of ISPI. I remember walking in to the conference, introducing myself. I mean, she didn't embrace me, I don't think then. Now she would if we see each other. But it was the most friendly, receptive, engaging bunch of people. It was wonderful. And so during that era, from the mid 80s through about 10 years ago, all the great thought leaders were there. Gilbert, Harless, Toasty, you go on and on. There's Rumler, I'm missing a lot of names. But so you got to hang with them. You could go to their presentations. You could talk to them in the halls. It was fantastic. And that's how I learned everything I learned, just by sticking to those people and trying to be mentors and saying, hey, emailing them and saying, hey, could we chat? I'd really like to talk to you about X. And most of them will say, yeah, I'll make time for you in my schedule. So then just to finish off my story, which is that we shut down Product Knowledge Systems. I moved to the West Coast. We started training people in this fluency-based approach. But over time, this plain English thing that we now call performance thinking was sort of evolving. And in about 2012, we decided to start teaching people how to do that too. And so we created a set of programs, and we would do big consulting projects on the one side, but then we would teach people in our performance thinking practitioner program, which is a certification program, and it certifies you when you complete a project following the logic using the tools that we teach. And so I started doing that. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, or maybe 3 or 4 years ago, before COVID, I stopped doing consulting projects, because it's very hard to run a business that both is about big consulting projects where you have to sort of live them in the shower, and think about them all the time, and a training business where you're trying to deliver training and certify others to do it. So we shifted to a model where our practitioner program, which is, as I say, is a performance consulting program, we would go into companies and develop teams of people who wanted to move from being, instructional design people or training and development people to being performance consultants. And we had a few companies like Amgen, which is our biggest and longest company, big biotech company. They started working with us in about 2012. I certified some people. They decided there were a lot more people interested. So I certified a fellow then to deliver our programs, and he did so. And a dozen years later, they've got 350 certified performance thinking practitioners across the whole country, a company which is global, and their senior executives consider it to be a strategic business advantage. And we've done that to a lesser degree. We have a coaching program that probably 500 people adopted at Change Healthcare, for example, and a few applied behavior analysis companies. But so we've gotten into the business of teaching people stuff, but then because we're accomplishment based, we want them to produce deliverables, and those deliverables need to meet certain criteria. And so that's what our coaching certificate, or both of our certification programs are. And we've also learned how to help HR business partners. And we were going to launch this program after a thorough analysis of HR business partner performance before COVID, and then COVID hit. So we're now in 2024, we'll probably relaunch this. But what we've learned is that HR business partners, and probably some of you know about what that means, they tend to be folks inside the companies who, especially if they're senior ones, they're kind of like management consultants that work with senior leaders, executives, director level people maybe, to help them address various problems and issues. And what we learned is that most HR business partners' performance can be thought of as managing or contributing to processes like strategic planning, budgeting, succession planning, et cetera. So we built a modular program for them, which would teach them how to apply this accomplishment-based approach to that. And the last thing I would say is that what I believe I've learned from all of this, besides find your mentors and stick to them like glue and learn from them, is that, and also I have more fun coaching other people through projects. I just finished one today at Kaiser Permanente. They've been working a year on this to analyze the sales performance, and it's hard. I don't know how many people have really tried to define accomplishments, but I realized a few years ago that the definition of accomplishments in our field is all over the place. It means a lot of different stuff. So we insist that an accomplishment is a countable thing. And so it has to be a noun. It's not the completion of behavior, it's the product of behavior. And it's hard for people to figure this out in most cases, unless it's very concrete things like deliverables. But things like relationships, decisions, transactions, those are all what we call work outputs or accomplishments too. And I found that the hardest part of this work is to get people to actually find and identify those. Once you do that, and you know what a good one is of whatever the accomplishment is, you can figure out the behavior for producing it by observing successful performers, by doing task analysis, by looking at exemplary performers. And then you can use the 6 boxes to arrange the conditions to support that. But the accomplishment part is the hard one. And so I spent almost a year with this group coaching them through this sales performance analysis. Today they finally got it. We just met a few hours ago. And it's so satisfying because you get to work through other people. And I enjoy that part a lot. So anyway, that's probably more than anybody ever wanted to hear, and it's a lot more than 20 minutes.